Today in Forza Horizon 5, we are going to be building a 900 plus horsepower rear-wheel drive converted R35 GTR drift car, and I'm going to take you all along on that process with me, and then we're going to hit some gorgeous canyon roads. But before we get started, I want to say a massive thank you to Thrustmaster for sponsoring the controller cam and for sending me out one of their eSwap XR controllers. And if you want to get one for yourselves, make sure you use the link to the Thrustmaster eShop in the description down below. Now, I did speed up the build process because I do agree that the build process would be pretty long to watch on its own. However, essentially a quick breakdown of what I did to this car was I threw the drift-focused differential in it, I rear-wheel drive converted it, I built up the VR38 engine about as far as I could go and made sure that I had the race turbos with anti-lag. Then I selected the semi-slick tires. I did not use drift tires for this car because on a car making this much power, it works out a little bit better in terms of drifting, in my opinion, if you run the semi-slicks as opposed to the drift tires. The drift tires work pretty well for lower power applications, but this car is making more than 950 horsepower, I believe somewhere around the 950 horsepower mark, and so when you're making around that much power, especially with a rear-wheel drive car, the semi-slicks work a little bit better because they do allow you to still grip up sideways with that much power, because you do need a little bit of grip in addition to the little bit of slip. And once we got a design on it that I liked, this was the final product. I really liked the way this livery came out in combination with the wing and the ADV1 wheels that we went with. I really like this livery. Mad props to the creator of this livery, by the way. And next up, we're going to jump into the tuning. Now, the tuning approach here is pretty simple. What I did was I went ahead and I brought the front tire pressure down quite a bit. I boosted the rear tire pressure up a little, not super far, but a little bit. Keep in mind that this was the initial tune, sort of the base tune, so I left the gearing alone. And then alignment-wise, I gave it a little bit of toe out in the front and a little bit of toe in the rear, and then bumped up the rear camber a little bit to about -3 degrees and left the front at -5 degrees. Now, sway bars, I made them a little bit softer in the rear and much softer in the front to give it a little bit of extra front bite, because again, when you're dealing with this much power, you need to soften the car up just a tad to allow it to really bite into the surface when you're running higher grip tires, because again, you know, we've got so much power in this car, I know it's going to be able to overpower the rear tires easily, so I want to be able to get back some of that mechanical grip that I would have lost before. And before we go any further, let me let y'all hear what the finished product sounds like. You know, if I said that this update wasn't my favorite update that has basically ever been made to Forza Horizon 5, I would be lying, because this update gives me that just smile factor, that giggle factor that I remember having in the days of Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and, you know, really the games that I truly grew up on. This update, and I know it sounds so simple, it sounds so, you know, kind of just, it sounds like, oh yeah, sure, whatever, because it seems like a small thing, right? It's like, you could boil this whole anti-lag thing down to like, oh yeah, it's just pops and bangs, whatever. But like, it's more than that. It really, truly is. At least to me, it's so much more than that, because I think it adds in an element of personality that gives you that smile factor, that giggle factor. You know, it ups the fun factor of driving these cars. And anything that makes the cars in this game more fun to drive and more fun to interact with and more entertaining to interact with makes the game better, in my opinion. Like, I have been more glued to Forza Horizon 5 ever since this latest update than literally any update they have released prior to this one. Now, that's not to say that the updates they released prior to this one were not awesome, but this update, like I said, has glued me to the game more than any other update they have released for this game in the past, and I think that that speaks volumes. Now let's talk about the car and my likes and dislikes about the build and where it is right now. I think the gearing needs to be played with a little bit. I like the alignment setup as it is, but I'm going to need to drive it a little bit more and kind of tune it specifically to the way I'm using the wheel module on this Thrustmaster eSwap XR controller. Now, I love the way the wheel module feels, but I would like to fine-tune my car setup to better match the way you have to approach driving with that wheel module. Now, it does allow for really, really precise adjustment, and I love that, but what I'm trying to do now, like I said before, is really go in and fine-tune and optimize the tuning setups. Now, this car is not going to win any leaderboard drift score competitions. This is more of a fun build. It's a fun car build for me, and it's a fun car build for the way I like to drive. This is basically what I would call a free roam focused drift car build. And when I say free roam focused, this car's not built for drift zones primarily. It's not built for drift adventure primarily either. It's built for having a blast, driving around the map, doing exactly what we're doing right now, and essentially going on really long skill chain combos. Now, this car would be perfect for any time a skill song comes on, because I believe at some point during this drive, a skill song did come on like once or twice, and I was able to get a very large score bump off of that skill song. But again, I think it's really important to note that it's okay to build drift cars that really don't have a dedicated purpose objectively in-game apart from being fun. Because for the longest time, I got really deep into, you know, I wouldn't build a car or I wouldn't drive a car if it wasn't going to be effective in drift zone scores, or if it wasn't going to be effective in drift adventure, or if it wasn't going to be competitive points-wise, I just wouldn't bother building it. And I eventually burned myself out on that because the cars ended up being not as much fun to use, because there was very little just enjoyment of the idea of drifting around the game world. It was like, okay, I'm solely building this car just for points, and if it ends up not being good at points, then the build was worthless and I felt like crap. But that's really not how I that's really not how I enjoy playing the game. And when I took a little bit of a step back and I looked at how I was playing the game, yes, there's absolutely nothing wrong with building a car for drift points. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with building a car for drift points, but if you build a car specifically for drift points, you got to remember that eventually, we drove right off into the dirt there. We recovered fine, but it wasn't the prettiest maneuver. But if you're building a car that's just solely for drift points, and there's literally no other, like, enjoyment factor in the car, that car kind of dries up for you really, really fast. And this was, like I said before, like, if it puts in a good score on a drift zone, cool. If it does decently well in a drift adventure, cool, that's great. But that's not the requirement for me for this car. That was not my reasoning behind building it or even tuning it the way that I tuned it. Like, I like to tune my drift cars in a little bit more of a realism-focused way, because I find them to handle a little bit smoother that way. Because, fun fact, drift zone tunes and drift adventure tunes are not really all that much based in any kind of real-world drift tuning. They're just solely based in what the game wants to get, like, what the game focuses on giving you in terms of points. It's solely focused on that, and that kind of pulled some of the enjoyment out of it for me. It really did. Now, again, like I said before, nothing wrong with building a car for drift points. I still do it. Nothing wrong with building a car to win drift adventure. Nothing wrong with building a car to win drift zones. I am not, saying any of those things are bad. Do not take any of that as me saying any of those things are bad, because they are not. They are just a particular way of playing the game. But again, my enjoyment factor of it comes in with builds like this, where they really are, at the end of the day, sheerly fun factor focused. Now, one thing that I will comment on about this build and my own personal experience of it, now that we've driven it for a decent while, is I will admit it's probably got too much power. It's either got too much power or the gears are too short, and I mean, I would probably back the power off to about 800 horsepower, and I feel like it would probably be a much better combination of grip and slip, because right now, in terms of grip and slip, it's a lot closer to slip than it is to grip, And, you know, there's a misconception that for a drift car, you just want as much power as possible and blow the tires off in any gear, and boom, you've got a drift car. And sure, you could treat it that way on a very basic level, but if you're really trying to maintain a certain speed, like for example, let's say you want the car to be most consistent when drifting on power at about 60 miles an hour, right? You're gonna want a balance of grip and slip for that. And the balance of grip and slip in this car is not quite at that point that I want it to be just yet. So I may pull a little bit of power out of it. I may mess around with the power settings just a little bit. Probably going to leave the tune alone for now. Now, again, I'm sure that there are going to be people out there that are going to say, well, you did this wrong in your tune. You also did this wrong in your tune. And everybody's got a little bit of a different way that they tune, because tuning is a very, very, very subjective exercise. The reason it's a very subjective exercise is because everybody drives a little bit differently, especially when it comes to drifting. Everybody's got a little bit of a different approach for the way they like the car to behave. Now, the tune that we did on this car was very much a base tune that I'm going to use as a sort of canvas to expand this car from. So it is by no means final, but it's definitely the approach that I would normally take with a build like this. And then we would either add in certain things, take away other things, until I've got the car to a place where I'm really, really, really happy with it. I enjoy it in the sort of mode that it's in right now, in the way that it feels right now. I enjoy the way the car feels. I just don't think it's at, you know, it's peak yet, and peak is probably a wrong way to say it, because builds like this are never fully done, but I think if I put just a little bit more effort into the finer points of this car, we could have a really, really, really consistent rig on our hands. But if y'all enjoyed this video and enjoyed this build, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. If you're new around here, hit that subscribe button and turn those notifications on, and I will see y'all next time.